Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Adri and IGC and the Government of Bihar for inviting, and a very happy Women's Day to all of us. So colleagues, friends, and everybody present here, it's definitely a pleasure and an honor to speak to this August gathering, and especially so because, I don't live in Bihar anymore, left it long ago, but this is the home state I have. So the declaration of March 8th as the International Women's Day, we need to go into the history. The history is not very long, but very significant. Because it's not very long, therefore it becomes significant. That hardly a little more than a century ago, women in various parts of the globe, especially in the already industrialized world, we take for granted the, women's empowerment in Europe, in the rest of the Western world, but it didn't exist and it didn't come easily. They were on the roads, there were protests all over, they were marching for justice, for equality, fighting for peace. There were huge women's rallies against war, and all that actually led to Declaration of International Women's Day in 1970s, and that was at the roots of it. So the women have not got justice without fighting for it, and that's an important part, that's an important point that we need to remember and be mindful of. In 1950, when an independent India adopted a constitution committed to equal rights, including equal rights for all to vote, it was also a declaration of a dream for an equal society, where everyone, irrespective of caste, sex, gender, or creed, would have equal opportunities to schooling, to good health, to speak and voice their opinion and dissent, to work, to elect, and to get elected. We have pursued that dream to some extent, but not always with full clarity and commitment, not always with consistency and force, and surely not always with success. This is not to deny that there has been a movement. We heard that there has been a movement. Definitely there has been a movement towards greater gender equality. But to assert that the movement has been slow, especially with respect to substantive gender equality. And it's important to differentiate between gender parity and gender equality, especially between nominal and substantive gender equality. And in that I loosely borrow from scholars like Naila Kabir and Amartya Sen to explain what I mean by differentiating between the two. Gender parity is the mathematical concept where there is equality in terms of representation in different spheres, be it education, health, employment, and so on. Equality, on the other hand, refers to equality of treatment and equality of opportunity. Substantive equality goes even further. It also refers to equality not in front of law alone, but also in terms of institutional mechanisms, in processes that ensure that these are enabled and practiced. Equality of agency is also critical to have a control on your own life, especially in making critical life choices. This brings us to Saint's notion of unfreedoms. And I actually find this notion of unfreedom very useful when we are talking of equality in any context, not only gender. Both boys and girls, men and women, face unfreedom, but they are much more and far worse for these are far worse for girls and women in most societies, especially ours, and and those which are like ours, patriarchal and full of diverse forms of structural inequalities all around. In these, gender inequality is indeed all pervasive and exists everywhere and at all levels. I think that's also important, that it doesn't only exist, but it exists in all sections of the society. Rich, poor, caste, all actually becomes one when it comes to gender inequality. What is While it is important, perhaps very important, to celebrate today the achievements related to the changes in the status of women in our society, it's equally and even more pertinent to reflect on how far behind we are from our own goal of a really equal society. In this process, we need not be defensive or view ourselves continuously in relation to others. I say this because, we often hear that, how US is doing, how England is doing, how Bangladesh is doing, how Pakistan is doing. That's not the point. We should know how we are doing, what we have dreamt about our own society, and whether we are moving towards that or not. And also, we need not be in denial. This doesn't happen anymore. This is a story from the past. The moment you talk about caste, gender, you hear these responses. I think we need to get out of that and face this with confidence and with commitment. We have to have our own goals, our own standards, and we need to judge ourselves against those. In this, I also don't want to refer to Bihar or any specific state in particular, because it's possible that Bihar is worse than another particular state, or in certain cases perhaps among all states. But the issues of substantive equality are issues of concern for the entire country, all states. And we can say that with confidence based on our own researches. So let's honestly examine a few markers. While doing so, I am fully aware that there are multiple realities that coexist. There is no one reality. Whenever we say that this exists, we also know that there is another reality. There are also homes where there is no discrimination. True, but recognition of multiple realities is also important, even for policy making. Unless we accept that, we will not move ahead. And India, especially being a large country and very, very diverse country, as one of our celebrated authors used to say, that different centuries exist together in India, and that's a fact. So we need to realize that there are multiple realities, and that actually calls for a layered understanding and very nuanced policy responses. Let's start with education, an area that I know and understand much better than others. If we look at data, which I'm not presenting here, we clearly see that in terms of school enrollment, we have made a definite progress, especially at elementary level. Although we still have, miles to go when it comes to secondary and higher education, yet gender parity exists at even those levels in many states. In fact, you will see a reverse gender parity in some of the southern states. Does that signify that we have achieved gender equality in education? No, far from this. Despite the fact that equal number of boys and girls attend educational institutions, there are inequalities in terms of treatment, expectations, and attendance. Let me share some of the recent research examples from the field. Let's see what happens in school. If there is a shortage of desks, and I'm giving you small examples, but significant examples. If there is a shortage of, say, desks and benches, who gets it and who doesn't? Here in Bihar, we have seen that girls sit on floors, while boys always sit on the benches if there is a shortage. And no one actually questions, even those girls are comfortable with that. So no one, neither teachers, nor boys, nor girls, nor parents, nobody is questioning. And what happens when you have desks and benches? What we saw in Andhra, that even when you have those, girls were sitting behind, especially secondary level we are talking. Because secondary level education, it becomes more critical, how teachers are teaching and the attention. So they sit behind. Who cleans the floor and who fills the water pot? Recently, it's just 2 weeks ago, in UP, we heard stories after stories from Dalit girls that they are always asked by teachers to sweep the floor, while upper caste boys are made to fill the water that they are not supposed even to touch. They are actually scolded, beaten for touching the water pot. The intersectionality of caste and gender shows its face in its worst form in horrifying stories of those girls being stalked and sexually harassed by upper caste youth, resulting into dropping out of girls. And it's not something from the past, it's 2 weeks ago. In absence of adequate seats in government colleges in Bihar, let me go to higher education now, we saw a good number of girls enrolled in private colleges that they never attend. So they are all enrolled. In the statistics, they will all be enrolled. It suits both the family and the institution. The institution doesn't have to hire faculties, and they only arrange for examinations, while the family doesn't have to pay for the transport, and more importantly, does not have the fear of their girls either being sexually harassed or falling in love. While safety and security concerns are genuine on one hand, it also hides parental control over girls' mobility and free will. In our work across the country, we have seen that the biggest fear most parents and families have is that their daughter would run away and marry on their own. In one place in Andhra, we saw that all girls from a village, and some even from neighboring villages, withdrawn from secondary school after one of the girls from the village ran away with a boy and got married. The chilling news of a father killing his own 18-year-old daughter from marrying a Dalit boy despite High Court protection 3 days ago in Rajasthan is not an exception. Different parts of the country report these, and for every reported case, there must be many more that go unreported. The fact that a girl or a woman is expected to uphold family honor by maintaining chastity had severe implications for her lack of control over her own life, and it also seriously conflicts with her education. It affects girls from all sections and all classes. Take early marriage. For instance, it has some linkages with poverty in some parts of the country, but it would be wrong to think that poverty alone is responsible for that. Our analysis of the district level data in 4 high incidence districts showed us that in certain cases, like Jamnagar in Gujarat, which has a very high incidence of early marriage, the incidence of child marriage was highest in the highest economic quintile, which meant that the rich, the highest was for the rich. It's also important to understand that early marriage is undesirable not only because it obstructs education and causes ill health due to early motherhood, but also because it restricts girls' freedom and life choices. And I'm saying this because of a particular incident that I had. And again, it's Gujarat. I was a member of a joint review mission for that Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan, and met a number of girls in, say, between 12 and 15 in schools. And when I raised this with the government, they said that as long as they are attending schools, they are not bothered about them getting married. It's not only about attending schools, it's about completely, and all of those girls, each one of them who I talked to, said that they have no choice but to go to their husband's village and do whatever they are told. So it's also about their own restricted life choices. So, and it's true that there are movements and many child marriages are being prevented, as you said. But for every prevented child marriage, there are many more that are not prevented. And I won't go into that, but here where we are doing our research, we faced that, and nothing could be done actually. Yeah, so what is true for early marriage is also true for violence, perhaps even more so. It's unrelentingly present in all sections of society, and it's indeed the most pervasive, disturbing, and unacceptable marker of gender inequality. Violence is linked with control. Control over everything: sexuality, mobility, expectations. Any action on the woman's part that is considered wrong or independent can lead to violence against her. Of the total, more than 4 lakh reported cases against women by National Crime Records Bureau in 2019, more than 30% were domestic violence, followed by about 20% cases of sexual assault, including rape. And as we know that for every reported case, there are like perhaps 20 times more, 30 times more that are maybe 50 times more that are unreported. Recently, we were in the field again, we were in UP for evaluation of a literacy program, and we struggled to meet a single woman, you know, in a number of days, who had no experience of violence. Not a single woman, you know, village after village you go to, and both the teachers of these literacy centers, and the women who come there from all castes. It largely were Dalit women, but there were also middle caste, Yadav, Kushwaha, the third caste, I forget the name. Each one of them had their struggle and had experiences. And anything could be a trigger. Disobeying, you know, on any front, big or small, is unacceptable. Mobility, of course, is one of the major issues of conflict. And mobility could be, you know, even going to this literacy center. It's not about mobility somewhere else. So mobility is definitely highly controlled. But even access to technology, including phone, is controlled. One of our recent studies on the impact of COVID-19 on education and livelihood, it was a multi-state study, where we clearly saw a gendered pattern of access to technology-enabled education. A much higher percentage of boys had access to telephone as compared to girls. And girls were also far more engaged, as you were talking about, in domestic and care work, leaving them much less time for studies. And we had witnessed such gendered pattern earlier also. We did a tracer study of graduates from NIOS, open schooling. And we could not talk to majority of girls because they are male family members, and they had all done their secondary or senior secondary, so they were not uneducated girls, but they were not allowed to talk to us despite the fact that interviewers were girls. So, you know, it's highly controlled. Even your conversation is controlled. So the question is, why are these not changing? Why even educated women succumb to such control? Or worse still, why women sanction such control in many cases? It then becomes important to understand that women are part of the same societies. Unwritten social norms and shared understanding regarding what is desirable and what is undesirable are the same for them as well. They too internalize it, and our education doesn't teach us to question any of these. Obedience is a celebrated value. You know, in our society, obedience is a very, very celebrated value in every sphere, but especially so in education, and even more so in the context of girls and women. The new education policy mentions obedience and righteous conduct as desirable values to be perpetuated by education without even defining what it means by these words. So suppose if girls are questioning unequal behavior, discrimination, is that something wrong because they are being disobedient? So you don't even define what you mean by obedience and righteous value, and especially righteous conduct in our society can be very much linked with maintenance of chastity in the context of girls, and schools can continue to reinforce unequal and restrictive social norms that perpetuate violence and strengthen unfreedoms. Therefore, what we see is that despite formal equality and presence of a number of constitutional and legal provisions that recognize equality between men and women, in practice, we are hardly moving towards any form of substantive equality. And this gap cannot be attributed only to policy implementation gap. You know, this is also common. If you have been in the area of policy research, you often hear that, no, our policies are good, but our implementation is bad. But I would like to argue that there are also problems in our policies. So what we have is that, you know, for instance, we don't have, you know, we have policies. Our objectives are very lofty and very verbose, but we don't have institutional mechanisms. And we cannot leave institutional mechanisms to implementation. It's our policy that has to define institutional mechanisms and practices that had to be non-negotiable. For example, you take gender equality in education. One is that equality of enrollment. That's one marker we have. And if you go to institutional level, then girls' toilet, which is important, but that alone cannot be the marker of equality. There have to be many more markers of school functioning that define gender equality in education. We rarely review our policies from perspective of its potential differential impact on different genders, or for that matter on different communities and economic groups. And this is true perhaps for all sectors. Let's take one example. Again, UP, because it's a recent, that's the last field we have been to, so it comes to you. It was 2004 that I did a study in UP, and we were looking at issue of gender. We were looking at actually macroeconomic policies for gender equality in education and trying to look at that. And what we had seen that mathematics teachers were not posted in any of the girls' school, and UP has a tradition of separate single-sex girls' schools at secondary level. And today, in 2021, it remains the same. It has not changed. So how will they study maths? And so they say that, oh, there's no demand. And if you ask the girls, they'll say, how will we offer? It's not even offered. How do we create demand? You create demand. If you want to change the situation, you create demand. You don't wait for the demand. And you respond to the demand, actually, which also is not happening. So women continue to face barriers, even when they succeed in completing their education to a level that allows them to enter labor market. We heard about glass ceiling. If you have been part of the senior management level, you would have heard the conversation that let's not hire young girls, they'll get pregnant. So and then these are the conversations which you have examples of laws that prevent you from having even such conversations in some countries. Here it goes, one can go on and on, the kind of informal network, the formal networks that prevent women from breaking those glass ceilings. And of course, labor market participation. Women represent only about 20% of the labor force in India, and it has been declining. India actually is among the only non-Islamic countries where it has been on the decline. Every other country, it has been on the rise. And there is a debate around what explains this decline, but the most common factors seem to be gender wage gap, restrictive social norms, and pushing out due to jobless growth, which has become, it's bound to become much worse during post-COVID. And there is there's a belief, there's a survey done in 2012, and 88% of respondents in India said that if there is a job crisis, it should be women who should be pushed out and men should have access to jobs. So it is the mindset we are talking about. That's the most important thing. And it's not that women don't work hard. You made references to work at home. Unequal burden of care work is an extremely important aspect. That how do you even when you have opportunities, how do you do that? You cannot work 28 hours and 24 hours. In one OECD report, which also includes India, a non-OECD country, that Indian women spend about 10 times more time for care work. It's one of the worst in the world. And if you are doing that, if you're working for 6-7 hours on care work, how do you do your studies? How do you do anything else? And as against about more than 6 actually, 7-8 hours per day, men spend about half an hour in chores. That must be perhaps doing something for their own. So, and it has gone worse. Economic survey actually, 1819 economic survey tells us that in the age group of 30 to 59, when actually you are not in education, most of the women are out of education and are married, the proportion of women attending domestic duties increased from 46% in 2005 to 65% in 2018. So it's not really changing, it's actually getting worse. And that is the point I would like to make, that in many cases when it comes to gender equality, we are perhaps now regressive rather than being progressive. So we may be moving towards gender parity there, but I think in terms of gender equality, we are going reverse. And that's important to take note of. Very deep-rooted and unmoving gender norms prevent us from thinking differently, and there has been hardly any notable effort. The new NCERT books, have some reference, and they are trying to instill those questioning gender roles from a young age. But then, textbook alone is not enough. You have to have that kind of teacher training, school ethos and culture for that textbook also to be effective. Coming back to job, feminization or concentration of women in low-paid and least secure jobs, and also perhaps most unsafe jobs, is another important phenomenon that we have. And this has been again true for both public and private sectors. Look at our, even COVID. Who were our frontline workers? ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers. They are one of the most, insecure. I keep actually, in Karnataka, Anganwadi workers are on a war path because of the decision to merge preschooling with school. And I keep thinking, and I have joined them at times in saying that if Anganwadi workers were men, in past 30, 40 years, things would have been different. The jobs would have become much more secure, better paid. Since they are women, we have, retained the insecure, low paid nature of their jobs. And of course, in private sector, look at call centers, look at any garment sector. So the most insecure jobs, most low-paid jobs are done by women. The enabling working conditions and supportive social security measures are absent to allow women to work, while fulfilling their part of the reproductive choices and responsibilities, without being singularly responsible for those, which is what you were talking about. That women alone should not be responsible for parenting or, for that matter, any other choice. So we need to reconceptualize and recast some of the policy tools to make them more tuned towards gender equal society. Let me illustrate with a few examples. Take a number of cash transfer schemes that exist in different states. I'm sure you all are aware of Bhagya Lakshmi, Dhan Lakshmi, Vidya Lakshmi, Apni Beti Apna Dhan. These are all the cash transfer schemes for girls. Look at the names. The names themselves, Apni Beti Apna Dhan, it objectifies girls. If you are not Paraya Dhan, you are my Dhan, but you are in the end Dhan. So you are objectifying. Bhagya Lakshmi, Dhana Lakshmi. So the names themselves are highly objectionable. But it's not only the name. Most of these are designed as conditional caste transfers to influence practices such as son preference. You were talking about, that's one indicator where Bihar has not moved ahead but has regressed. And these are also conditional to withdrawal of girls from secondary school and early marriage. But if cash starvation is not the reason for these practices, how can the lure of cash solve it? If I don't want a daughter, I cannot be lured by 20,000 rupees. I will still go and abort my female fetus. So there is something wrong in linking cash to these issues, which are deep-rooted social issues, which are issues of mindset, which are issues of... yeah, and like early marriage, practice of son preference is not necessarily and not usually linked with poverty, but with deep-rooted social norms. Who goes, who can even afford to go for sex determination test? It's not the poorest women. It's those who have access to some money. So how do you do that? And cash transfer even in other forms. Look at, for example, when you start transferring cash instead of providing textbooks, and that we are seeing again in our research. Parents are not buying textbooks for girls. So girls are not really getting those textbooks. So governments need to think twice. That's why it's important to foresee the gender differentiated impact of the action. So converting everything to cash had serious gender implications that need to be weighed upon. Son preference, again, evidence tells us that wherever you have increased labor force participation rates, even in South Asia, the son preference has gone down. And our own history tells us, look at southern states, without any family planning specific program, they achieved it by simply working on literacy and education, the birth rate lowering. So I think what we need is hardcore, very serious and very committed programs for education, for health, for employment, and that would lead to change in mindset. Of course, we have to work towards that. Mobilization, education, the nature of education has to change. Let's take another example of policy instrument, gender budgets. While we have made progress, especially in terms of more and more states adopting it, and CAG bringing a report on it has added one form of accountability, it still remains very rudimentary in its conception and inaccurate in its application. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that gender budget in India has two lists. One that's entirely meant for women, 100% women-oriented programs, or girl-oriented programs. And the second list where 30%, if 30% users or beneficiaries, so to say, are supposed to be women or girls, the budgets are accordingly apportioned. These are largely arbitrary and at times highly questionable. I'll give you one example. I think it was 2014, I don't remember exactly the year. Government of India added the entire expenditure on that medical college, Vardhaman Mahavir Medical College. That's the Safdarjung hospital-linked college, if you are familiar with Delhi, as gender budget. It's not a women-only college, and there are several examples. I can list hundreds that have gone there, so that's a very deliberate, faulty application of the notion. And of course, if you go to the use, then it's further, questionable. For example, look at health insurance. Now, more and more states, as a country, we are following the American model rather than, borrowing from other countries, of using health financing, health insurance as our policy instrument to address the issue of health. And what happens when it's health insurance? It has a very gendered implication. In our research in Karnataka, what we found that women use it only for two purposes. Highest use, of course, reproductive, and the next, you will be perhaps surprised to know, is burn. So the burn has high uses. Why? Perhaps not dowry death alone, maybe a small percentage, but it's linked to cooking. So, and the rest, and we also linked it with incidence. Cardiovascular disease is believed to be a man's disease, which it is not. If you actually go to medical data, the cause of death, it's equal for men and women. If you look at the health insurance, the use by women is much less. You are not even allowed to go to hospital to claim the insurance that you have an entitlement to through a government subsidy scheme. So when you go for such policy instruments, there is a problem. And that's why substantive gender equality becomes critical. And look at politics. Bihar was the first state, as we know, to introduce 50% reservation in panchayats. And across the country, we have at least 33% everywhere. Many states have now gone for 50%. And what do we see? Apart from the phenomenon of Pradhanpati, Sarpanchpati, Mukhyapati, or we also see actually father-in-law, Putra Vadhu hai hamari panchayat pradhan. But even when from, we saw that even when from Mahila Samakhya areas, where women were actually winning the elections and going to attend, they were not being treated equally. We have witnessed panchayat meetings where women who had won elections, they were ward members, and they wanted to sit, they were not even made to sit on the chairs because the upper caste men who were not really panchayat mukhya but mukhya pati would sit on the chair, and these empowered women will not be allowed even to speak. So again, we need institutional mechanisms. And I really believe that these are difficult problems and difficult to approach, yet we can do that. If we have, very well thought institutional mechanisms and processes, we can make a much faster progress, rather than wait for social change to happen on its own. So in the end, I argue for the need, for paying attention to the issue of substantive gender equality in policy discourses and policy practices, if we are really committed to the dream of an equal society. If not, we would be marching past on March 8th, making some movements and showcasing our achievements, but not really moving ahead. I don't know how many of you, but I remember as a young girl participating in those parades where we would be told, in Hindi we call it Kadam Tal, and I remember actually my teacher announcing, Jahan tha wahi rah, Kadam Tal shuru. So jahan ho wahi raho, and you start moving your feet. So you are moving, but you are not moving ahead. So it's important that we get out of this Kadam Tal mode and make a real shift. I would like to end on a personal and positive note, having reminded us of our slow movement towards substantive gender equality. I also would like to say all is not lost. And despite all our limitations, we have individuals who make the systems move. And let me take the liberty of citing a personal example, especially here in this town. It's important. And so I started with education. Let me end with education. Patna is not my hometown, but Bihar is my home state. I grew up and went to a government school in Katihar. Actually, that time when I went to school, we had separate science sections in secondary. And my science section had 3 girls and 47 boys. And then I did my intermediate and undergraduate actually from Patna Women's College here, where I met some of my best teachers. And I have tried to actually imitate them when I myself worked in education. While we had many teachers who would tell us we should pray for a good husband, as that is what would make or break our lives, we had one English teacher, an independent Muslim woman, Muniba Sami, I don't know if any of you know her, who taught us to question everything, religion, hierarchy, inequality, using wonderful pedagogy of art, drama, and debates. We had one history teacher, Papya Ghosh, who is now dead, who taught us to look at historical facts from diverse perspectives, teaching us that there is no one fact, there are multiple facts. Till the time we have such teachers who subvert the system and teach students to think critically and question, surely there is hope. Thank you once again.